Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Why don't we just jump right into Richard Saville-Smith and Sharday Mosurinjohn's Archaeology of a Thesis, Genealogy of a Belief, the Mystical Detour in Psychedelic Science.
Hello.
Thank you for having us. I'm Sharday Mosurinjohn. I'm an associate professor in the School of Religion at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, where my research has had to do with psychedelics, esotericism, crisis of meaning, and it was really through that first book project of mine about the meaning crisis that I got into psychedelics as a way to totally re-encounter ontologically the very conditions of meaning. And through that work, I came to know my friend Richard Saville-Smith, and we have been collaborating on a paper that we're going to share with you today. We'll make a preprint available after this, called The Mystic Trip. And it is about psychedelic science's foundational measurement instrument, which is the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. And I say we'll make a preprint available because we have had a hell of a time getting this published for a couple of years now, because there is tremendous protectiveness about the MEQ still in psychedelic science. Richard?
Hi, I'm Richard Saville-Smith. I come from Scotland. I've got my Indigenous dress on today. and I live on the island of Skye at the end of a long single-track road in the middle of a mushroom patch. This is true. My psychedelics were mostly in the early 80s, so some time ago, because I'm old. And we went up with punk and we came down with reggae. More merry pranksters, perhaps, than academics. But, you know, I've done the academic stuff since then. I've got a PhD from the University of Edinburgh. I do MAD studies. MAD studies is I don't know, I suppose it's just taking madness seriously as a contribution to, life epistemology, whatever you like. You use words as you like. So I do MAD studies, and I'm very fascinated. I've always been caught up with the idea of psychotomimetic, how that was erased by psychedelic. And I think this is something that we've got attention about, and we will come back to later.
So we would like to get a sense of who among you has heard of the MEQ. Raise your hand. Keep your hand up if you have read through all of its items. And keep your hand up if you have had a mystical experience per the criteria of the MEQ. All right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to talk a lot about Walter Pahnke. So this is, for us, this is holy ground. We're here in Harvard. We are just joyful to be here in Harvard. We love everybody. We want to be your friends. We want you to be our friends. We don't want to offend anyone or upset anyone, and we'll try not to, okay? But don't take offense. And there are two foundational texts within Pahnke, within what we're talking about. One is Walter's Thesis, Mysticism and Philosophy. So who knows of mysticism and philosophy? Okay. And who has had a substantial engagement with mysticism and philosophy? Okay, right.
It's out of print, so it's not easy to come by. And how about Pahnke's dissertation, Drugs and Mysticism? Hands up if you have heard of it. And keep your hands up if you have substantively engaged with it. Unpublished.
Yeah.
So we should tell you what that dissertation is about. We want to really draw attention to the dissertation itself and the philosophical and methodological underpinnings of it. But what the experiment was, the Good Friday experiment, occurred at Marsh Chapel, and this was basically 20 seminarians, 10 of them on psilocybin, in the church basement on the occasion of Good Friday, hearing that Good Friday sermon piped into the basement while on mushrooms, with the intention of trying to trigger or occasion a mystical experience.
Yeah, but the thing with the Good Friday experiment is that people will have heard of the Good Friday experiment, but because Pankey's thesis is unpublished and extends to about 350 pages, is that you tend not to understand the methodological context that actually frames what he's doing with the Good Friday experiment. And it's into that territory that we're going to try and take you today.
So what's up with the basement and a bunch of guys in the basement? This was drawing from R. Gordon Wasson's imagination of what constituted indigenous tribal rituals with psychedelics for thousands of years. Now, we heard yesterday about just how impoverished Gordon Wasson's imagination of psychedelic use, or the use of things that we are now calling psychedelic among indigenous peoples, was. And so Pankey decided that this setting would be broadly comparable to this traditional tribal usage, a communal situation, a ritual situation, something taking place in this kind of a social context. But there's a big inconsistency between that and the set of the whole thing, really, which was from a different thinker, which was Walter Stace.
And Walter Stace was a professor at Princeton at the time. He was in his 80s and when he published his book, Mysticism and Philosophy. And he'd spent his life in Ceylon, in the British Civil Service in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. And so he came to Princeton with a whole set of ideas about Indian mysticism. He talks about illumination and enlightenment as being preferable terms to mysticism, but obviously those are kind of foreign terms, so he carries on with the mysticism. And what he does is that he cherry picks a set of mystics from around the world, from across a couple of thousand years, from Plotinus all the way up, from America, from India, from Europe, and he cherry picks these misusing Wittgenstein's family resemblance ideas. Yeah, so he's got like basically a Premier League of mystics, and this Premier League he then describes characteristics. What are the characteristics of these mystical experiences? And he comes up with 7 typological characteristics. Yeah, and it's really important to understand, and Sharday will say more about it in a moment, but I'm just going to nip in here, is that Stace is coming out of a world of higher religion, and higher religions are the Abrahamic religions and Hinduism and Buddhism. Yeah, Stace has absolutely no time at all for indigenous religions, for the type of people that Wasson's talking about. I'm treading your territory.
We can share because we come in peace. That's how friendly we really are. And so he creates this essentialized thing that underlies supposedly all of the world's religions, but only the ones that matter. And it is this sort of experience without qualities. It's unity above all else. No embodiment, no visions, no voices, nothing. That gets disqualified as a secondary type of maybe extrovertive mysticism that doesn't properly fulfill the category of introvertive mysticism. And guess who doesn't ever get to have that experience, according to Stace, is the indigenous peoples on whose imagined traditions Wasson is doing his writing, and that Pankey bases his setting on. So we have in this moment of the experiment what Richard and I have come to call a methodological car crash of these absolutely incommensurable premises, which Pankey never remarks on. He doesn't bother at all to attempt any theoretical join of these things. And another issue is that Stace, when he describes these perfect unitive experiences of a mystical consciousness, describes it in a categorical fashion. It happened or it didn't. But in Pankey's work, he creates a dimensional measure. He creates a continuum. He puts it on a Likert scale. And In fact, there is an arbitrary grade bar that gets introduced much, much later. And that is because even according to his own framework of his own study, actually, the experiment failed. Nobody had a complete mystical experience. So he has to introduce this grade bar in order to get anybody over it. But again, that incommensurability with what is a categorical thing, which therefore is not to be measured per stace, is simply never addressed.
Yeah, and so what we're describing to you is two huge problems. One is this Eastern mysticism, this kind of cerebral type consciousness type thing, and two, this imagined landscape of indigenous psychedelic use that's happened for thousands of years. Yeah, these are two things that are taken together and banged into this thesis like that. And then the other thing that Sharday's just described is this move from the categorical mystical experience of Stace. So Stace has mysticism with his Premier League and then describes it, whereas Pankey takes these characteristics and tries to get people towards that by saying, if we've got enough of this, this is complete. And he puts in this grade bar at 60, it settles, it begins at 60 to 70% in 1967. He's terribly coy about his results. He doesn't really get into saying this stuff until much, much later in 1967. And what happens then is that you basically have prohibition and everything's just shut down. You know, Sandoz stops delivering drugs and everything goes dark. And then when you start opening up again in 2006 with Griffith's psilocybin kind of occasion mystical type experiences, what you get is, the way I describe it, is it's like going into a disused room and finding all the furniture all there, just with a bit of dust on it, and it gets dusted off, okay? So that what you find is that the 60% grade bar flips from the 1960s into 2006 with no methodological justification or examination as to why 60% is a relevant figure or a possible figure, even according to Stace.
And in that, to use Christian's term, drug fog of war, fog of drug war, JCG, what's the term? Fog the drug war. There's no replication, so there's no inquiry into these incommensurable premises. And what there is in that time, though, is there's outcome switching and there is cheerleading. So this grade bar gets even further out, and the Good Friday experiment starts getting reported as having occasioned not a mystical experience, but just a religious experience, and that it happened for everybody. And so there's less and less incentive to actually really inquire about the premises on which it all stands, which just to really zoom out and land this point, it was neither taking mysticism seriously, which to do so would have been to become adequate to that type of knowledge and practice and realize that per the mystics' terms, this is not something to measure in the first place. This is not amenable to operationalization in a quantitative type of scientific study, does not require scientific validation. And it also wasn't taking science seriously because it didn't actually look at, is this a valid construct? Is there construct validity here before developing a measurement instrument and then going out and measuring things with it?
And it's interesting because Pankey's, I mean, you got to hold tight to this thing about Pankey's thesis. Pankey's thesis was titled Drugs and Mysticism. It wasn't titled Drugs and Religious Experience. It wasn't titled Drugs and, God or whatever. It was titled Drugs and Mysticism. And the mysticism, as we've explained, is drawn directly from Stace. Stace kicked out William James. Disgusting man.
That's very rude.
He kicked out all the previous scholarship and said, I'm going to start again. and this is how I'm going to do it. He was quite well. He was quite an arrogant writer, but he's very sure of himself. So I think we can be sure of ourselves. But what's interesting is that around about the same time, you've got Abraham Maslow, writing about peak experiences. And in his book, Peak Experiences, Religions and Values, is that right? Maybe. That comes out in 1962. Now, Pankey has got Maslow, an earlier text, in his bibliography. So we know that Pankey knew Maslow, right? But Maslow, peak experiences, would have made arguably just as good a term as mysticism operationally. And in fact, Maslow, in the appendix of Maslow's book, he's got a set of 20 questions which are remarkably similar to the MEQ, yeah, and could have been just like pretty much translated across. But what I speculate is that you've got to understand the times, is that at the time, what Leary and Alpert, Pankey's supervisors, were doing was engaging in a cultural argument about the role of psychedelics, in which taking on religion by giving the highest experiences that are most validated within religious traditions, made accessible through psychedelics, gave psychedelics a validity which they otherwise could not have. So faced with the choice of going with peak experiences, which was a novel term and had little leverage, or challenging the whole of the religious tradition and saying, aha, look what we've got here, you can see why it ended up being mysticism.
That's right. So this is in some ways an intra-Christian sort of beef, and appealing to these legitimating systems of Christian religion and science, as opposed to asking, wait, are those adequate to this kind of inquiry? When the MEQ gets dusted off, one more methodological thing does happen, which is that actually the whole communal sort of conceit does drop out, and what we get is eye shades and headphones and solo experiences, rather than the kind of communal experience from which much of the healing might come. And again, a further taking of these beings into the realm of substances, drugs that anybody could have, rather than having to make relationship with them, become adequate to that encounter, and live it out in a life world where it makes sense according to one's spiritual purposes, cosmology, context, conditions of accountability and relationality. So we get this individualization happening.
So at around this point, you're thinking that we're being mean to Pankey, yeah? And we want to turn it around, because lots of people write a PhD thesis and then go on to write better work. That's what Pankey did. He went on to write another bunch of papers across the 1960s. And what he does in his later work is he doesn't let go of mysticism, but he expands his typology. So it has, well, for me, from a mad studies point of view, one of the things he adds is psychosis. So that his psychosis and mysticism as part of the same framing of the psychedelic experience, which is very Jamesian, okay? And it's also very, very much something that we can flip to the next three, which are, let's go.
I like the aesthetic.
He does mystical, psychotic, aesthetic, cognitive psychodynamic, okay? So,
we love them.
So that is Pankey's 5-part typology. And if you take that 5-part typology, you can back psychedelic sciences out of the fetishization of mysticism into a much more interesting and diverse world. And that's really what we're advocating for today.
It will allow much better interdisciplinary conversations of the kind that we are having so richly at this conference, that are so clearly valuable, to be able to inhabit each other's language games, have more fun playing each other's language games.
Yeah, because I mean, we're religious studies scholars, you know, and like when psychedelic scientists start talking to us about mysticism,
With love in our hearts. And there certainly are other instruments that have attempted to further secularize or expand the MEQ. But there is still a kind of centering of this sort of generic unitive type of experience or peak experiences. And so we again want to step back to question the whole premises of, are we making instruments methodological tools that are adequate to the job? If you want to frame a house, use a hammer. If you want to paint a painting, use a paintbrush. And something like the much more richly qualitative types of studies of which we have heard this weekend is a much more adequate tool to the job of encountering, meeting, inquiring into whatever it is that goes by the name of mysticism.
Thank you.
That was fun. Nicolas Langlitz is professor of anthropology and the founder and director of the Psychedelic Humanities Lab at the New School, and he'll be speaking on pharmacosociality, and an idiographic approach to psychedelics and people.
Thank you. Works, no?
Yes. That's
Scroll, okay. So I recognize that there is a very strong showing here, I'm sorry, on the part of the Divinity School and people who are interested in psychedelics from a religious angle. But I think the psychedelic renaissance, with its goal to carve out an institutional space for psychedelics in mainstream society, has mostly been driven by biomedicine. And in the past 15 years, we have seen a transition from its preclinical phase in the 1990s and 2000s to the clinical phase. And the main vehicle for that have been randomized controlled trials, which aim at establishing drug effects in the form of generalizable knowledge. So what does psilocybin do to depression across populations, across contexts, and abstracted from the singularity of any given person's encounter with any given substance? Oh, I have to scroll. So that is a perfectly reasonable strategy if the goal is to achieve market approval by the FDA. At about the same time as the psychedelic renaissance entered into its clinical phase, we've also seen the rise of the psychedelic humanities since about the 2010s as a complement to this. And the question is, what kind of complement is it? Are the psychedelic humanities providing ethical commentary, historical context, a cultural critique of biomedicalization? And I want to argue that the psychedelic humanities serve as an epistemological complement to the psychedelic sciences. So the psychedelic humanities share an epistemic object with psychopharmacology, namely psychoactive drugs and what they do to people, but they approach it in a fundamentally different way. To conceptualize this, I want to draw from a late 19th century German philosopher, Wilhelm Windelband, who was the president of the University of Strasbourg, where in 1894 he gave his inauguration address in which he rejected the division between Natur and Geisteswissenschaften, so natural sciences and I don't know, human sciences or humanities, which is a division that is based on ontology. So the natural sciences have nature as their object, and the Geisteswissenschaften have spirit as their object. What Windelband proposed instead was a purely epistemological distinction within the sciences of experience between nomothetic and idiographic approaches. So nomothetic approaches aim at seeking general laws, and idiographic approaches attend to singular events, particular people, and specific objects. So this doesn't map neatly onto the sciences versus humanities opposition, but it cuts across these two cultures. For example, you could think of natural history as a form of idiographic natural science, and you could think of historians who are seeking general laws of historical change as a form of nomothetic humanities. And psychopharmacology as it stands is largely a nomothetic science, and I want to argue that the psychedelic humanities serve as a form of idiographic drug research. Now, this opposition of nomothetic versus idiographic might just seem like a matter of disciplinary habit or taste, but I want to argue that here in the case of psychedelics, the object demands to be studied idiographically. And I'm taking a cue from philosopher of science Ian Hacking, especially from his book, Social Construction of What, in which Hacking argues that constructionism plays out differently from object to object. So if you're familiar with Hacking's work, the most frequently cited distinction there is between human and natural kinds, but in the social construction of what, you find much more fine-grained discussions of how social construction arguments play out differently for people or states or mental conditions or practices or material objects and so on. So Hacking described himself as a philosopher of the particular case, and I think psychedelics are quite a particular case in many respects, but one important respect is that their effects are context dependent. They are shaped by psychology, relationships, culture, the environment in which they're taken, and so on. That might also be true for other substances like alcohol, opiates, or antidepressants, but presumably in a different fashion and mediated through different mechanisms. So context isn't just noise to control for through randomized controlled trials, but it is part of the phenomenon. And an idiographic approach that focuses on the particulars is therefore not just an epistemological preference, but it responds to the nature of the object itself. Okay, now I want to show you that what an idiographic psychopharmacology might look like by turning to the work of Alexander and Anne Shulgin. So many of you know that Alexander Shulgin moved from a position at Dow Pharmaceuticals in 1965 to his farm in Lafayette, California, where he set up a private lab in a wooden shack in which he synthesized more than 200 novel psychedelic compounds, mostly phenethylamines. And he tested all of these molecules on himself, and then with his wife Anne, and eventually with a circle of 10 to 12 friends. So these were not randomized controlled trials, but this was a different model of psychopharmacological knowledge production that was more akin to the self-experiments of 19th century romantics. Shulgin was less interested in the general than in the particular, and he assumed a continuity between self-knowledge and the knowledge of nature. Shulgin attributed a unique character to every drug, but this character did not determine a specific effect. Instead, he argued that the experience resided in the user's mind and emerged from the interaction between this particular individual and the drug's particular character. For example, when he first took mescaline, he experienced intense beauty, and then he synthesized a mescaline analog, 3,4,5-3-methoxyamphetamine, or TMA, and this induced a state of intense anger in him. And he wrote, mescaline no more produced beauty than TMA produced anger. Just as the beauty was always within me, so was the anger. Different drugs may sometimes open different doors in a person, but all those doors lead out of the same unconscious. So this is a relational epistemology. The tester is as much a contributor to the final definition of the drug's action as is the drug itself, he wrote. The drug's personality emerges only in the encounter. So this is what Windelband would have referred to as an event. And I think this is the core of an idiographic psychopharmacology, that here knowledge is produced in and through particular relationships. In the 1980s, toxicology journals began to reject Shulgin's article submissions because he did not have IRB approval for his self-experiments and collective self-experiments. And in response, the Shulgins invented a new genre of writing about drugs. Pikal was the paradigm for this. It's a thick book, Pikal, A Chemical Love Story, which is half chemistry cookbook and half memoir. And each chapter is dedicated to one substance, TMA, MMDA, DOM to CT4, and so on, and offers thick descriptions of setting and the relationships in which the drugs were used. So here, drugs serve as mediators of human relationships. And I think a helpful conceptual distinction to think about it can be borrowed from science studies scholar Bruno Latour, who distinguished between mediators and intermediaries. So intermediaries are means that serve a particular end and allow humans to realize that end. So say you have depression, you take an antidepressant and your depressive symptoms get better. That would be an intermediary. A mediator transforms the ends in the process. So it's a means that transforms the ends, right? So I would say a classical example of this would be the Hopkins smoking cessation study describes how subjects were taking psilocybin to get rid of their nicotine habit and come out of the trial having different goals in life. So in Pikal, the chapters usually describe how the Shulgins or their friends ingest a new substance to epistemic ends, getting to know the drug's psychotropic effects and learning something about themselves. But often the means, that is the drugs, transform these epistemic into existential ends. So for example, an MDMA experience leads a chemistry student to overcome his stutter and become a speech therapist instead of a chemist. Or a 2CE experience leads Alexander Shulgin to abandon his desire to become a hermit and continue to conduct his research collectively. So these reports represent a literary form that reflects a particularist epistemology. And psychedelics mediated many, if not most, of the Shulgin's relationships. So the subtitle of Pikal, A Chemical Love Story, has a double meaning. It refers to the Shulgin's love of phenethylamines. Pikal is short for phenethylamines I have known and loved. But it also refers to the romantic bond between Alexander and Shulgin, which was also mediated by their shared drug experiences. Psychedelics also mediate relationships with their friends in collective self-experimentation. They mediate a whole underground research network and friendships with DEA chemists who share a passion for chemistry with Shulgin. They mediate relationships within a psychonautic community. I picked this photo with Earth and Fire from Arrowit because they provide the digital infrastructure for this psychonaut community to get together around substances that often Shulgin had created. And they mediate the therapeutic relationships that Anne Shulgin, as an MDMA therapist, engaged in. And they mediate relationships in a psychedelic community that meets at events like Burning Man or at conferences like this one. So psychedelics are the glue of a form of life that's experimental through and through. And I would refer to that as pharmacosociality. That is the ways pharmaceuticals constitute, mediate, and transform human relationships. And pharmacosociality calls for a sociopharmacology, not a psychopharmacology, but a sociopharmacology of different drugs, which is both nomothetic and idiographic. Okay, now I want to situate this in a slightly broader sociological framework, both the story about the Shulgins and my argument about the psychedelic humanities. And this I take from the German sociologist Andreas Reckwitz, and especially his book Society of Singularities, in which Reckwitz argues that modernity is often understood as a consistent movement toward rationalization, standardization, and so on, what he calls doing generality. And science, especially nomothetic science, is a paradigm case of doing generality in this sense. But Reckwitz also points out that almost from the start, modernity also valorized singularity. So with Romanticism, this becomes a strong cultural force. And initially it is confined to the arts and to the bohemian margins of society. Then in the course of the 19th century, it becomes a key element of bourgeois life, where singularity is cultivated in private. And then with the counterculture of the 1960s, it's beginning to pave the way for a mainstreaming of practices of singularity, which eventually from the 1980s onwards leads to what Reckwitz describes as late modernity, which shifted the weight from the logic of the general to the logic of the particular. So, I mean, just think of this famous Apple ad, "Think Different," right, from 1997. That would be like the like the slogan of doing singularity. Now, the Shulgins were part of that cultural transition from 1960s San Francisco counterculture to this sort of mainstreamed form of Burning Man. And Shulgin developed drugs in the service of singularity with an epistemology that valued the singular. So his dose ranges might prove reliable, and that is generalizable, but his encounters with his drugs' characters did not. They were singular. So this is what I describe as a psychopharmacology of singularities. And Reckwitz himself describes doing psychedelics as a form of doing singularity. I mean, think of Leary, who took LSD to break out of the robot society, intensify experiences, find deeper meaning, connect with one's true self, and so on. I think this can be contrasted with administering psychiatric drugs to conform with everyone else in society, which would be the psychopharmacological equivalent to doing generality. The psychedelic renaissance is a form of mainstreaming this, right? It basically takes this impulse from the counterculture and tries to bring it into mainstream society. I mean, that's basically the core of late modernity, according to Reckwitz. Okay, so I want to close by contrasting this idiographic approach to psychedelic research with the tradition that dominated the philosophy of psychedelics from the 1960s to the early days of the psychedelic renaissance, which is Aldous Huxley's perennial philosophy. So as you probably know, the basic idea of the perennial philosophy is that there is a transcultural and transhistorical core of all religions: prayer, meditation, fasting, self-flagellation, and psychedelics. And it doesn't matter which psychedelic, they're all interchangeable paths to the same unio mystica. So this is a lumpers philosophy. But the Shulgins were splitters. Each compound had its own psychospiritual character, which opens a different door of perception. What you found on the other side of an encounter with 2CB was not what you found with ayahuasca, and what Shulgin found was not what his wife found, and neither was what their friends found. So each encounter is singular, and the pharmacology supports this kind of splitting. Each psychedelic has a different neurochemistry. There is a lot of work now on the so-called receptorome, different second messenger systems that are activated by different psychedelic substances. And this kind of splitting has philosophical consequences. The perennialist position rests on the assumption that all doors of perception open toward the same experiential space. But if you take the Shulgin seriously, these are multiple experiential spaces, and they're not aligned with any one moral, political, or societal agenda, but they serve as tools in a pluralist consciousness culture. So what does an idiographic psychedelic humanities contribute? Psychedelic humanities don't, in my view, don't aim at a critique of biomedicalization or identity politics, as in emancipating one's psychedelic identities or queer states of mind, but they represent an idiographic epistemic supplement to nomothetic drug science. They have the same object as psychopharmacology, but pursue it with different epistemic approach. And therefore, the psychedelic humanities are attentive to the multiplicity of ways particular drugs and particular people shape each other, and how drugs mediate particular human relationships. And I think, this is why the psychedelic humanities are key to integrating psychedelics into late modern societies. Thank you.
Our third or fourth presenter, depending on how you're counting, Hana Abbasian holds an MS in bioethics from Harvard Medical School and works on the integration of Islamic and global perspectives into modern bioethics. She'll be talking today about between revelation and regulation, Sufism, psychedelics, and the ethics of consciousness in Islamic thought.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Hana. Today, I have the honor to talk about the history of psychedelic ethics, or how people in the Middle Eastern region would perceive consciousness. So let's move forward. First of all, for a little bit of context right now, there is not much recorded about history of people using different psychedelic substances in the Middle Eastern region. However, there are some evidence of blue water lily in Egypt and Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, as well as using these kind of substances in different Middle Eastern countries, for example, in Israeli context. But of course, we know that people in these regions have been experimenting with consciousness as a concept. And what does it mean to exist? What does it mean to live in the moment, like these kind of stuff, whether through substances or spiritual experiences? So first of all, one might ask, what exactly is Sufism? Sufism was a spiritual philosophical movement which started in the 8th century in response to more rigid or more formal traditional ways of practicing Islam. And Sufism has a very deep emphasis on inner journey, the spiritual aspects of religion, for example, how one might include love and acceptance, radical acceptance into their practice. And there is no one single founder of Sufism movement. However, there are multiple famous philosophers, poets, and architects who have been pretty much influential in this movement. Give me a sec, I want to open this slide. All right. Yeah, so In this practice, people try to get close to divine love or divine God through different practices. One of them is remembrance or zikr. This is something that Muslims practice on a daily basis, which simply means just kind of like repeating words of self-affirmation or like positive affirmations throughout the day, also some religious stuff. The other one is all right. Maybe I should be more specific. But the other one is called Sama. You might heard of this kind of dance, spiritual dance before. It's been practiced for centuries. Right now, you can find it in modern day Turkey, which is simply men and women raising their hands towards the sky and raising their hands towards the earth and spinning for hours and hours. Yeah, so it's kind of like a way of practicing how to exist in a moment through dance and how to be in one line or be aligned with the rhythm of the world. This is very much founded by Rumi, which you might have heard of it before. We're going to explore it today. And he was kind of the inventor of these kind of dances, very much. So in this kind of dance, what they're practicing is two concepts of fana and baqa. Fana literally means self-destruction, annihilation, means becoming nothing. And subsistence or baqa means existing forever. So this is some sort of contradiction, what it means to not exist and what it means to exist forever. And this is what many of these Sufism concepts have been based on. All right, so let's start with traditional frameworks. In traditional frameworks, keeping your consciousness intact is very important. So, for example, the reason some of your Muslim friends don't drink alcohol is because they believe their consciousness is very sacred and they don't want to, for example, have other altered kind of consciousness. So it's pretty much, let's say, stigmatized or prohibited. And aql, or having that rational power, is very much central to what it means to be like a good Muslim, let's say. And we have three other levels of certainty in Islam. So something interesting is that many people who have different faiths may not be certain or may be struggling with like belief. Let's say, I don't believe the story, or this doesn't sound logic to me, and these kind of stuff. So in Islamic traditions, we have three levels of certainty or yaqeen. One of them is knowledge through learning. Let's say I go to a lecture, I go to a conference, I open and read the religious texts. These are all different kind of certainty through learning. The other one is knowledge through direct perception. One might say that artificial intelligence have changed this a lot. For example, in the past, when Muslim philosophers were writing stuff, they would say, I saw it because I saw it, so it's real. I saw it with my own eyes, so it's real. We can't say this in the modern age anymore. I saw videos, but are they real? I saw photos, but are they real? I saw the news, are they real? And the last and most divine level of certainty is knowledge through lived experience. Means that special spiritual moments in your life, can certainly believe in something. Let's say love can be some sort of this last level of certainty. When you love someone, when you see a version of them that they may not see, you are believing in them through a different level. You don't believe in them because you learned from someone, or you don't believe in them because you saw them, but you believe in them through your inner journey or through your understanding of them. So let's start with Rumi. Rumi is a very famous Persian poet. He was born in modern-day Afghanistan. At the time of Rumi, modern-day Afghanistan had a very heavy Buddhist influence. So even though Rumi has lots of poems in praise of Prophet Muhammad and Islamic concepts, he's also very much heavily impacted by Buddhism. And the biggest Buddha statue was in Afghanistan, which unfortunately is destroyed. So he had an emphasis of divine love and unity of all beings. Three main concepts that can be tracked in his poems are kashf, vasht, and fana. These are all Arabic words. Now I will walk you through it. So kashf very much is discovering. Let's say you're just living your ordinary life, and is that one moment, one person, or one experience that turns you into a different person? Or it can be gradual or all of a sudden, but mostly in Persian philosophy and literature, you see lots of sudden encounters or sudden like philosophical encounters which change their life forever. So kashf is very much discovering yourself all of a sudden. Let's say I'm just a teacher and all of a sudden I become some sort of like very important spiritual person. So kashf is part of understanding that we are ordinary, but we are special. We are very small in comparison to how huge this universe is, but we're also very big because of the soul we hold within. So that's very much what kashf is. The next stage is vasht. This is where like you can relate some, like you can find some parallels to psychedelics. Vajd is very much ecstasy, or that one moment that you hold lots of joy, power, and knowledge in yourself. So when someone starts their spiritual journey, they may, for example, they may experience disappointments, they may experience depression, fear. But Vajd is just the opposite, is the power you hold and that moment of joy, which you understand how much knowledge you have within. And lots of poets have been in these stages and they write pretty much like, let's say, grandiose poems about themselves. For example, Bayazid Bastami, another famous poet, goes to the Islamic pilgrimage called Hajj. And in the Islamic pilgrimage, people rotate around Kaaba. Like, let's say it's an important spiritual place which people are rotating around something. Bayazid was in the Vajd state and he writes, I went to rotate around the Kaaba, but I saw that Kaaba is rotating around me. So he was very much like, let's say when you read these poems, you might be like, wow, this person is full of ego, or they're really much full with themselves. But it's not the case. They're just experiencing that kind of spiritual joy. And last but not least, we have Fana. Fana is another Arabic term. It means, let's say, self-destruction. It means annihilation. It means when you don't feel like you actually exist. You are part of a larger thing and you're not you anymore. An example of Fana in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Kurdish literature is the famous story of Layli and Majnun, which is actually some sort of Middle Eastern Romeo and Juliet, but with more philosophical depth. So Majnun is the male and Layli is the female, and they are in a very intense form of love. Majnun goes and knocks the door of Layli and says, I'm Majnun. Layli doesn't open the door. Majnun knocks again, says, I'm Majnun. Layli doesn't open the door. Last time Majnun says, I'm Layli, and that's when Layli opens the door, which means that you should not exist as a different being. You should be me. We should be one. Something like that. So Fana is the last stage of this practice. Here's a QR code of a puppet opera of Rumi life, which was in Tehran, Iran, and it has English subtitles. It's full for free on YouTube. And in this, you can see how the Rumi spiritual journey started. So he was very much a respected scholar in his community. And he was actually practicing a very traditional form of Islam until another poet and philosopher called Shams comes to his life and starts enlightening him and starts telling him that he should get completely void of yourself. And you have lots of ego and you think you're the best and you think you know a lot. But let me show you that's not the case. And in part of this theater, also, you can see a part of Moses' life. So I recommend reading a little bit about like Islamic history or stories, but watching this definitely is such a good experience. And for the context, Rumi was born in Afghanistan, lived in Iran for a very short while. After the Mongolian attack, they went to Turkey. So now he's buried in Turkey. He has poems in Persian, Turkish, and Arabic, but most of his poems are in Persian. Now we go to another famous philosopher and poet, Al-Ghazali. He was also born and died in Iran. He has a book called Deliverance from Error. Here he starts saying that he's very much skeptic towards what's reality. Like he's actually putting doubt in everything he sees. So I think he would hate AI because he was just, he was just watching with his normal eye and he had lots of doubt. And right now that we have this AI videos and stuff, and we can even keep it, like take his head and put it on, I don't know, Bill Clinton. I mean, he wouldn't like it. He wouldn't definitely like it. And in his book, actually, he writes that there is a deep difference between authentic illumination and delusion. So interestingly, if you're interested in understanding the understanding of like mental health disorders in the Middle Eastern region, I definitely recommend Dr. Rania Avad publications. This is where I get this slide from. The Islamic Psychology Lab at Stanford University. What it means here is that unfortunately, even till this day, there's lots of stigma around mental health disorders, right? At time of Ghazali, of course, mental health disorders exist, but we don't have any modern day treatment for them. And these people are very much like marginalized in the society. So here he believes that he is in a superior moral place than people who are experiencing, for example, psychosis or like other mental health disorders. And he believes that I'm getting this through divine experience, not through like some sort of mental health problem. So I'm better than them. These opinions would come across as very discriminatory, right? But it's understandable, like when we think of his time and how people would think of someone with mental health disorder. And he actually emphasizes that he believes that taking substances and like losing yourself is not moral. And he thinks that all these kind of mystic experiences, divine experiences should come from your own reflection. And you should reach this status by a like kind of special virtue, not through taking substances or having a mental health disorder. Last but not least, we have Ibn Arabi. So he was born in Spain, which is an interesting fact about him. Like his literature, his poems, his philosophy is part of the Muslim heritage in Spain. He lived in Spain for a while, then he went to Saudi Arabia and North Africa, and he died in Syria. So what he exactly said was Wahdat al-Wujud, or unity of being. This is something that became very much popular in the modern literature, that he was more like, we are all one and there is no me and you. Like he was more about accepting each other, becoming one, and he was very much against hate and discrimination. So he was more open-minded, let's say. And the word he uses, al-khiyal, or imagination. In contrast to Ghazali, Ibn Arabi had so much respect for imagination. Let's say when an individual with mental health disorder would come and say, I heard this voice or I saw this person, he would respect that. And he would accept that as the lived reality of that person. So let's say if he was living in modern day, he would even be against like treatments for mental health disorders. He would say, why you're disrespecting this person version of reality. So let's say if he was living in the modern day, I think he would maybe be interested in taking some special substances. And yeah. So he believed that human consciousness is barzakh. This word is another Arabic word in Islamic tradition. It means where the souls live after death, but before the day of resurrection. So let's say we have this understanding of heaven and hell, but there is one step before that, which these souls are just there and observing things till the day of resurrection comes. And he believed that our consciousness, our understanding of our existence is actually part of that death. So he believed on everyday death. Let's say he believed every time you sleep, one version of you dies, and the next time that you wake up, another version of you rises up. And this can be like, as I said, there are lots of parallels between what he describes and our modern understanding of what happens to the human brain when they're taking substances. Last but not least, I want you to pay attention to this beautiful photo. This is a mosque in Iran. As you can see, the ceiling or the dome are like the places that the special effort is there. They very much believe that the geometry or the way that they're building mosques have a very specific direct relation with how a person perceives the mosque and the divine experience of them. So geometry was an important part of building mosques in the past. And they believe that when someone enters this room, they would have an altered consciousness, or just by looking at the ceiling, they would have a different view of themselves and of God. So the ego dissolution is the part that we can relate very much to the psychedelics, like what happens to the sense of self, what person thinks of themselves as a being when they're taking different substances. I think this is the part that would be very interesting to like do some further research on it, like because I'm going to read you a Persian poem right now. And as you might see, this is a poem from Rumi. He is explaining how he's explaining how he feels dead and alive, how he feels nothing and everything at one moment. So this is Persian. I'm going to read it and then I'm going to show the English translation. مرده بودم زنده شدم، گریه بودم خنده شدم، دولت عشق آمد و من دولت پاینده شدم. گفت که دیوانه نی، لایق این خانه نی، رفتم و دیوانه شدم، سلسله بندنده شدم. گفت که سرمست نی، رو که از این دست نی، رفتم و سرمست شدم و از طرب آکنده شدم. گفت که تو کشته نی، در طرب آغشته نی، پیش رخ زنده کنش کشته و افکنده شدم. گفت که تو زیرککی، مست خیالی و شکی، گول شدم، هول شدم و از همه برکنده شدم. گفت که تو شمع شدی، قبله این جمع شدی، جمع نیم، شمع نیم، دود پراکنده شدم. So here is a translation. Pretty much he's explaining that I felt I was like whipping, but now I became laughter. I was dead, now I became alive. And he is having a discussion with Shams, which is his spiritual mentor. And this poem is actually, I believe it's included in the theater, in the play as well. So Shams pretty much is telling him that you are not mad. And so madness is being seen as a virtue. And this can be seen across many Middle Eastern poems. For example, Omar Khayyam or Attar Neyshaburi. Being mad is a virtue. Like let's say not being normal is being seen as a superior moral stance. Not in all poets, of course, but in some poets. And here he says that I was a scholar, now I became as a mad person. I became out of myself. And the Shams again says that you're not ecstatic. You're not as happy and joyful as you should be. He goes and turns ecstatic and filled with joy. And at the end, the last line, the Shams tells him that you are the candle and you are the center of this gathering. Like we are all gathering around you for light. So he's actually praising him. And the Rumi reply here is very much interesting. He says, I'm not the gathering, I'm not the candle, I am the scattered smoke. Like when they turn off the flame of the candle and there is a scattered smoke in the room, he says, I'm the scattered smoke, I'm not the candle or the gathering. This may ring a bell. Like, I don't know if someone feels this is familiar or not, but this is actually a very famous story in Buddhism, that one of the followers of Buddha goes to the Buddha and asks, where do we go after death? And Buddha says, when you turn off the flame of a candle, if you can tell me where the smoke goes, I will tell you where you will go after death. So you can see the direct implications of Buddhism on Rumi poems here as well. And thanks for listening.
Thank you, Hana. Rebekah Senānāyaka is an anthropologist and a cultural psychologist whose doctoral work analyzed interspecies communication in Amazonian traditional knowledge. She also completed an apprenticeship with a leading maestro in the Upper Amazon, and today we'll be speaking on this. The plants are always speaking, extending multi-species liminality through Dieta.
Oh, it's done something. Thank you so much. Okay. Over 27 months in the Amazonian rainforest of Colombia and Peru, 12 of which were fieldwork for my doctoral degree, 11 maestros from 5 indigenous groups told me a version of "it was the plants that told us" when I asked them how they know their vast knowledge on medicinal plants. I would later learn that the plants can be used for both healing and for harm. And this paper focuses on the process of connection, which precludes both practices. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Psychedelic Intersections for providing the platform for this work to enter the wider world. Thank you to Jeff. Thank you to Paul for organizing this wonderful conference and bringing together so many unique perspectives to deepen our understanding of the psychedelic landscape. This is timely and necessary in the current climate. Thank you to Professor Charles Stang and the Center for the Study of World Religions for hosting this conference. As I touch on in this paper, this is an intellectual refuge where my own Buddhist roots and Amazonian research find common ground, a place where Eastern and Indigenous perspectives can be braided together. I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to, in many ways, return this work to Harvard University, which has traditionally been the academic home and patron for Amazonian ethnobotany. Harvard shaped the entire discipline, our study of hallucinogens, our approach to working with Indigenous communities, and the recognition of Indigenous peoples as experts in pharmacology and beyond. It modeled honest intellectual curiosity into the profound healing powers of plants, and for that, this feels like a homecoming for this research. My deepest gratitude to systems ecologist and my uncle, Dr. Ranul Senānāyaka, for planting the seed of Amazonia in the heart of a young girl at age 10 to inspire a decade of research. I extend my deep gratitude to Dr. Mark Plotkin, the last student of Richard Evans Schultes and president of the Amazon Conservation Team, which continues to tirelessly fight for the protection of Indigenous peoples, for his long-standing ethnobotanical guidance in my research, and for joining us here in person today. I extend my profound gratitude to the Amazonian rainforest societies who have so generously shared their time and wisdom with me, especially the Lamista Quechua, among whom the majority of my fieldwork has been conducted. My deepest gratitude to my teacher, Maestro Don Roberto Corral Vargas, for opening the door when he had never taught a woman before, and to my fellow apprentices who I studied alongside. And finally, my gratitude to the master plants themselves, without whom none of this would exist. My fieldwork has been long and grueling at many points. It took me to the very skeleton of my existence. But to have the opportunity to share this work with you here today, in the institution where it belongs, makes it all worthwhile for the good of all, plant, human, and beyond. Also, I am the Rebekah who flew from New Zealand, so the jet lag is very present. From my first experience drinking the potent psychoactive sacrament ayahuasca with the Bora 10 years ago, to commencing an invited formal apprenticeship with La Mista Quechua Maestro, Don Roberto, as a student 4 years later, the words, "It was the plants that told us," continued to brew and bubble in the back of my mind. When I started learning the master plants beyond ayahuasca, Don Roberto asked me if I had seen the spirits in their ceremonies. This was in 2019, approximately 100 ceremonies in. And sure enough, I started seeing how the visionary colors changed depending on what plants I was taking. And soon enough, the characters started appearing in my visions that I had not seen in the 100 ceremonies prior. When I asked Don Roberto more philosophical questions about how ayahuasca derives its knowledge, he left me alone with a bottle to ask the plant myself. These were my first ceremonies alone and at the very start of my apprenticeship. As per his guidance, I began to develop a relationship with the plant without distractions. He deferred to the plant in a way one may defer to an expert colleague. To this day, my experience with altered states of consciousness includes 400 hours in sensory deprivation tanks, including 6-hour sessions with psychedelics, approximately 200 ayahuasca ceremonies, and multiple dietas with master plants. This has calibrated something similar to a control state in my body and my mind. My Amazonian colleagues have also calibrated their baselines over stringent apprenticeship practices lasting several years. In the laboratory of the body, the specificities of various plants and their uses can be identified. Throughout my apprenticeship, the visions were used as guiding information to determine which plants I would learn from. Don Roberto said the plants will tell you which ones to take, and soon enough a purple flower appeared, leading to the first in-depth ethnographic account of Chiricsanango, which Harvard professor and a man often considered to be the father of ethnobotany, Richard Evans Schultes, called for more intensive fieldwork on. Schultes declined to take the plant himself, although he was a master of Amazonian poisons. Since conducting my doctoral fieldwork in 2022 and 2023, one paper has been published on Chiricsanango in clinical therapeutic settings with a cohort of male participants in 2026. However, no in-depth ethnographic account exists from within the apprenticeship tradition through which this knowledge is transmitted, nor from the perspective of a woman. Interestingly, the subjective experiences of the participants in the 2026 study and my ethnographic evidence, first presented at Breaking Convention in 2025, show many overlaps. The plants have been speaking to humans for millennia. And it is not only in the Amazon where this happens. From my own cultural heritage, which is Sri Lankan Sinhalese, we can see how a sapling from the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha attained enlightenment was taken from India to Sri Lanka. And with it, Buddha's social and cultural order took root in our island nation. It was planted in 288 BC, making it the oldest living tree in the world with a known planting date. Saplings are sent across the globe in the modern day as an offering of peace and goodwill, a reminder that it was not just the Buddha, but the tree under which he attained enlightenment. In his 1999 paper, Burning the Library of Amazonia, Schultes cautions the researcher who perceives indigenous plant knowledge as magical and superstitious, and the scientist who refuses to acknowledge its profundity at all. The paper I present today presents a necessary theoretical backbone to bridge this gap: extended multi-species liminality. Extended multi-species liminality refers to a process where advanced Amazonian traditional practitioners become partially plant through rigorous apprenticeship protocols. As I extend in forthcoming articles on ritual transgression, the framework is falsifiable and replicable, providing a robust scientific framework for studying plant species and consciousness that Amazonian traditional practitioners have been doing for a very long time. The theoretical framework builds on Van Gennep's tripartite rites of passage structure: separation, liminality, and reincorporation. But instead, it asserts that seasoned practitioners do not fully reintegrate as human selves. Instead, they remain in an extended multi-species state where they can draw on these relationships to provide healing, guidance, and leadership to individuals and their societies. This wisdom comes from a hybrid consciousness between human and plant, fused through rigorous apprenticeship protocols. When further wisdom is needed, advice is sought directly from the plants themselves, often through ceremonies involving the ingestion of psychoactive plant brew, ayahuasca. To develop extended multi-species liminality, I used the anthropological methods of intuitive ethnography through participant observation and deep hanging out within a multi-species autoethnographical framework, which involved human and plants as conscious actors and collaborators. I immersed myself in the field site and practices with ayahuasca ceremonies as they were held twice weekly, and apprenticeship rites. I spent time in the wider societal landscape to understand how traditional knowledge on plants is situated within the community. I sought advice from Don Roberto on how best to acquire the deeper knowledge I sought for my doctoral research, and the humans and the plants set my curriculum. He suggested I begin with Dieta, as this was how he had learned. So I did several as part of my fieldwork, each with their unique plants and requirements. I worked with 2 practitioners. I grounded my findings through ethnographic interviews with traditional knowledge experts. So now I will share with you an ethnographic vignette from a Dieta with master plant Chirik Sanango, often called the teacher of teacher plants. So if you feel comfortable to do so, I would invite you to close your eyes and focus on my words. The cartilage in my bones felt like it was going to burst from the inside out. My teeth shatter. My forehead burned with an energy that surged from the back of my head forward into a raging beam of light from the same point where years prior my visions had shown a pathway of apprenticeship. It was an hour before the ayahuasca ceremony, and I finally reached the point of breaking with Sanango that practitioners talked about. The crushing force through my bones that felt like they would explode from the inside out. And the reason many are afraid to die at the bark and more so the root where the stronger knowledge is held. The Chirik Sanango continued to thrash like a serpent in water too shallow to hold its fuerza. Heating my body, I felt the spread of anesthesia from the back of my throat forward, a sign for more water. Every nervous fiber felt activated. I fed the plant water and let it writhe. It had been 2 days since the last time I drank Sanango, yet before the ceremony, it roared to life again, almost as if it knew it was going to meet ayahuasca. A clap of thunder split the sky, the jungle storm broke open, and rain poured as the Ikaro grew stronger. The Sanango roared in unison with the rolling thunder. Okay, you can come back now. Sanānāyaka, Chirik meaning cold or chills in Quechua, is a potent master plant in the Amazonian traditional knowledge system. Local understandings say it first removes the chills from the body, and then it adds its heat. It is used in the treatment of arthritis, neurodegenerative diseases, and to increase vitality. The Dieta protocols are more stringent due to its strength, with the strongest restrictions in the diet of the root. With the stringent protocols comes even more severe consequences if the Dieta is broken. Dieta is an Amazonian method of connecting with plants used in healing and apprenticeship. Although the word directly translates to diet, and there is a food diet involved, it extends further to behavior restrictions and isolation whilst consuming one or more master plants, and the use of an entheogen like ayahuasca to connect the plant to the body. My ethnographic interviews showed two main types of dieta, la dieta suave and la dieta fuerte. The dieta suave, or the soft diet, is used for healing and for a moderate level of learning. It was what I started my apprenticeship with for 3 months with ayahuasca. La dieta fuerte, or the strong diet, is used for the acquisition of knowledge and apprenticeship, to know what a plant is and to make the body strong. All dietas carry food, behavioral, and social restrictions. La dieta suave permits a small amount of salt and sugar, but la dieta fuerte prohibits both entirely, along with carnivorous animals and fruit and fats. The strongest dietas, such as that of the Chirik Sanānāyaka root, are understood to permanently incorporate the plant in the body of the practitioner, constituting the apprenticeship itself. Each plant carries its own additional requirements, and for Chirik Sanānāyaka, these include no fruit, no oils, and no dramatic fluctuations in temperature from bathing, sun exposure, or tobacco smoking. In Dom Roberto's practice, these dietas usually go for 1 month. My Amazonian collaborators kept saying that the plants stay in your system after la dieta fuerte. I observed advanced practitioners drink minute doses of ayahuasca in the ceremonies, not needing to drink more because of the plants they kept in their system from their apprenticeship dietas. With Dom Roberto, I observed how 40 years from his dietas, he still maintained some of these dietary restrictions, not out of desire, but because the food stopped agreeing with his body. How he identifies if someone has done the dietas and has actually done the apprenticeship is the physical state of their body. So 34 months after my dietas fuerte with Chirik Sanānāyaka on a separate continent and a completely different entheogen, the plant announced itself again through the same somatic signature. And the silva, or the whistle, melody of an ikaro arose spontaneously. I presented this whistle to world music expert and composer, Dr. Kim Cuneo, who identified a signature unstable beat characteristic of non-Western musical composition that arose organically through this entheogen and the plants I had dieted in the Amazon 34 months prior. I will now share that with you. 1 second, I've never whistled into a microphone like this. Bit muffly, but anyways, there we go. And so to wrap up, in his 1967 paper for the ESPD conference, Schulte says he wasn't even sure if Chirik Sanānāyaka is psychoactive. He gathers brief accounts of his use, but states that hallucinogenic knowledge is rapidly disappearing. In my decade of Amazonian engagement, in the present day, I have seen something similar. But rather than the knowledge being lost, I have observed that the overarching practice of dieta and intensive apprenticeship is what is disappearing. The process of apprenticeship requires devoted time, isolation, and dedication, which is often in conflict with the fast pace of modern life. Amazonian apprenticeships are typically 3 to 5 years, and as with Don Roberto's generation, were done in isolation in the jungle with no salt, no sugar, and all the other restrictions. In his case, he dieted 20 of the big trees of the Amazon as part of his apprenticeship. Those were the plants that spoke to him and what his teacher encouraged him to learn, like he did with me. The master trees are so strong that they require isolation days away from any human life. The rise of fake shamanism and practitioners specializing only in ayahuasca without the broader apprenticeship and the other master plants has led to malpractice, coercion, and in the worst cases, even death. So Dieta presents a unique, replicable, and falsifiable method for studying plants and altered states of consciousness. As advanced practitioners develop a baseline calibration, they're able to study the plants in the vessels of their bodies. However, to do so requires permanent sacrifice, with changes to behavior, food, and environmental preferences to last their entire lifetimes. Anthropologist and keynote at this very conference 2 years ago, Luis Eduardo Luna, calls ayahuasca an epistemological wildcard for the challenge it brings to how we acquire knowledge. I extend that to say that Dieta is the next epistemological wildcard. It opens up the vast worlds of Amazonian pharmacopoeia to which ayahuasca is the threshold guardian. It provides hope for Schulte's dismay at the loss of knowledge on psychoactive plants. Through Dieta, it can still be accessed. However, it requires time, commitment, and discipline, and there are no shortcuts. Studying the chemicals of plants in the lab is a highly fruitful endeavor for advances in medicine. But to understand how plants shape human civilization and evolution, disciplines like anthropology, with the ethnographic fieldwork and theoretical backbone, and ethnobotany, where the field meets the lab and traditional knowledge is practiced and prioritized and protected, are essential. They allow us to glimpse at the large-scale effects the natural world has on our mere human existence. I opened this presentation by saying it was the plants that told us. And as my fieldwork has shown, the plants are always speaking, and through Dieta, the sound starts coming from inside the house. Thank you very much.
Great. I'm sure there are no questions. Everything is clear. I'm going to limit myself to 1.5 at a maximum 2 questions, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot coming from all of you. I'm reflecting on the ostensible umbrella theme for this session of consciousness, and I'm noticing 2 themes that really jumped out. First, there were 2 presentations on theoreticians, on Western elite academic dudes. And then there were 2 presentations on people very far from that cloister and from different backgrounds and sociocultural contexts. And yet, I think we're all kind of complicating certain dogmas of the movement, whatever that is, whatever happens in Denver every 2 years. Complicating mysticism, complicating the nomothetic approach of the scientific model, complicating from the previous session, the gaps idea that psychedelics are everywhere and similar, and that the drug is the point, rather than other altered state technologies, such as Sufi practices or communities. And complicating scientific categories of what makes psychedelics efficacious, about whether plants have consciousness, about sources of knowledge, even which plants we'd heard of. I didn't think I was going to hear about a new psychedelic today, and I did. Part of me wonders if we're all doing footnotes to Ramsey's talk, in that we're just kind of shifting, and actually the graphic, which is not up on the screen right now, of the prism, right? That there has been a kind of, and it makes sense as an organizing principle of a new discipline. What is this about? What do we believe? We believe these 10 things. This is kind of it. Here's the 10 commandments. And that's kind of what we do. And now, as the field comes into a bit more maturity, it turns out it's just this gorgeous mosaic of glorious proliferation. And paired with that feels like the second theme that emerged for me, which has to do with imagination and subjectivity, also a footnote to your talk. Not that we're in a kind of chaos where we can't say anything about anything, but maybe we're in just a richer, deeper place of Sterngroth's non-specific amplifiers. That there's just these compounds or these practices turn up the volume in a certain way of human and from Rebekah's presentation, non-human subjectivity and consciousness. But what's being intensified really seems to depend a lot, right? And I'll get to my specifics on like the beating up on the MEQ in maybe my second question, but this variety of peak experiences, a variety of drug effects, a variety of means, of technologies, even varieties of boundaries of human, non-human experience. So I love this phrase just from the end, the epistemological wildcard. And that's where I want to just open this to whoever on the panel feels inspired to respond. Another way of talking about epistemological wildcards might be madness or imagination. And maybe that makes a lot of sense, right? A lot of academics think we're the crazy people, right? I mean, they think the discipline is mad in a certain ableist way. And I wonder about the radical subjectivity of experience, the madness of Sufi mystics also. And maybe not seen as madness in the culture in which Rebekah was embedded, but, talking to plants and hearing back, these are serious challenges to a certain Western scientific dominant worldview. Then from within that worldview, that seems nuts. That seems crazy. How could that be, right? But from a different worldview, that makes all the sense in the world, right? And it even was it's kind of evidence-based, right? It's like, well, you do the practice. I remember, I think it was Ken Wilber. So it was like when somebody tells you about their peak experience, you don't have to despair. You follow the instructions to see what's there, right? It's actually a radical empiricism. So do the dietas and see. And lo and behold, what the data that emerged, quote unquote, is just something that happens to be at odds with a certain narrow metaphysical worldview that happens to be predominant in places like Cambridge. So that's the opening question, something around epistemological wildcards, imagination, and possible iterations of madness.
Magic. I want to go back to some of the Rumi poems about madness and how he considers madness a virtue. In one of the poems called Bemirid, Bemirid, Darin Ishq Bemirid, the poem is titled You Should Die, You Should Die, You Should Die in This Love, which he is probably discussing divine love or some other sort of love. I don't know, whoever he was in love with. No, seriously, because it's pretty vague. Like even the scholars who are studying his life are not quite sure whether these poems are about divine life, are about his wife, are about his spiritual mentor Shams. It's pretty much vague. But an interesting theme that emerged through these poems is that he is advising his students to become mad. And later on, he also writes that through Sama, or through that dance, through like spinning all the time for hours, his goal is to become aligned with the rhythm of movement of clouds in the sky and movement of fetus in the mother's womb. So he believed that there's a certain rhythm in the world that you cannot achieve without becoming mad or without letting go of all these rules and laws and orders. So that just like, it's a very interesting theme, because within the ableist modern frameworks, we may think of psychiatric disorders as some sort of like not normal. You're deviating and destabilizing the society, like you're going out of our reality, and now you need treatment. this is where the over medicalization comes from. Like, you need treatment because you have a different reality. And yeah, I think this can have many implications for modern day psychiatry in the future.
So does it work? Yeah. So I think, psychedelic knowledge is a wild amalgamation of very different knowledge cultures, right? And I've been thinking a lot about this relationship between the sciences and the humanities, but originally the humanities did not emerge as the opposite of the sciences, but they emerged as a counterpoint to the divinities, right? And so these are three different knowledge cultures. And then you have in Rebekah's talk a fourth one, which is this idea that you learn from plant teachers. That's definitely not in the books of any of these European traditions. And it seems to me that it really requires a lot more epistemological reflection and analysis how these different knowledge cultures relate to each other, in which ways they're incommensurable with each other, in which ways they might complement each other. That for me, that would be one question that I would like to hear more about. If you study this form of Shipibo knowledge from an anthropological perspective, it's also a clash of two knowledge cultures, right? There is anthropological knowledge, and then there is the knowledge that the plants are providing. How do these things relate, right? Is there incommensurability? Can you translate the knowledge that the plant teachers are providing into some anthropological truth claim? And I just generally think that there needs to be a lot more reflection on these different knowledge cultures.
So I think there's a really interesting contrast between these experiences of madness and what I've experienced in the Peruvian Amazon from these ways of connecting to plants. And what I've noticed for my teacher, Dom Roberto, is that he is incredibly disciplined. So in the ceremonies and even with any connection to plant, there's a focus on composure and not losing yourself to the psychoactive. And when I started my apprenticeship, he kept saying, tienes que dominar, you need to learn how to dominate the plant, and not necessarily in a bad way, but you just need to always be in charge. So I find that incredibly interesting with experiences of madness, which are very different in their nature. And I was reading Luna's 1986 thesis once again the other day, and he talks about the interviews with one of his participants about the visions themselves. And the traditional knowledge expert he talks to says, well, actually, the quality of your visions comes from how much you can concentrate. And the same thing was said to me in Dieta. If you want to make the most out of this Dieta, tienes que concentrar. You need to learn how to concentrate. The same in the ayahuasca ceremonies, you need to be composed. So it's quite interesting to have this tension between madness and then this very disciplined approach. In a forthcoming paper on ritual osmosis and porous interspecies membranes, I draw quite heavily on Mary Douglas's work with the Brahmins, because that's also a way of removing something to get closer to the divine. And that also has this very disciplined approach. So there are a lot of conversations to be had here and a lot of further research to be done.
I just coined the term the botanities to go with the humanities.
Can I riff on botanities? So something that I just thought of, Nick, when you said, that this type of knowledge is not in the European books, I thought, oh, well, there is occult botany. There are traditions of, and of course, not in the books that you're talking about, but I was just thinking about this, and this was mentioned, I think, by Maria yesterday as well, like especially women's folk knowledge. And yeah, occult herbalism, esoteric botany, et cetera, et cetera. And I bring that in relation to, say, the knowledge that is learned from a practice of like Dieta. When I teach my students in my drugs and religion course, and I say, yeah, this is replicable, and you can't do this from inside your paradigm. And so you got to zoom out. I give them the Exeter metaphysics matrix just as a tool to be like, you got to figure out where you are. What is your worldview from which you're operating? And how do you get bigger and transcend and include that paradigm in order to make an inquiry where this doesn't seem crazy in the uncool way? And I have PhD students who are wanting to go do field work in the Amazon. If you're watching right now, I hope you just heard Rebekah's talk, where it's like absolutely necessary to do that kind of positioning of how are we coming to this so that we can actually make knowledge that is commensurable and translatable instead of just extractive and taking it back. And the final thing, just in terms of the epistemological wildcardness of it all, that I wanted to mention when Richard and I were talking is that, say, that Good Friday experiment with mushrooms and guys in the church basement, that wasn't a study about mysticism. That was a study about mushrooms and those guys. And so what we think we're looking for and what we get and what we're actually doing and how we're able to examine what are we actually doing and trying to experience is, I think, part of the big answer to, yeah, how do we make that kind of synthetic move?
As a mad person who does get locked up in psychiatric hospitals every now and again, I don't really want to say too much because part of it is about diversity. And I think it's very difficult to get sucked into, kind of ideas of, how to practice madness. Well, I think this gets really interesting when you frame Western and non-Western cultural interpretations of, say, visions and voices, as opposed to possession practices. You find that possession practices tend to be South Asian and African, and visions and voices tend to be Western, more Western like that. And when you start then putting that into the context of, say, the DSM-5 and taking your psychiatry, and you find that the visions and voices are in the schizophrenia and other psychotic, whatever it's called, and the possession is over in dissociative identity disorder, you find that there's a whole kind of cleaving within the psychiatric framework that actually maps a cultural cleaving within what humans have done with their own experiences of madness, which are diverse. I would go back very briefly to my psychotomimetics, which I started with, is mimicking psychosis is my friend Tom and me took our first LSD in my flat in Edinburgh in, 1980 or something like that. And he had a terrible time. And I had a fabulous time. And it was the same drug.
Thanks. I got more, but I'm not going to do it. Yeah, I wanted just the last little piece and then go right to the group is specific on, I love the addition to the anti-mystical experience questionnaire library. I've written a contribution to that. Sharday's written one in the past. We're kind of beating it up. I can't think of anything worse for the PR of the psychedelic renaissance than psychotomimetics, right? And it would have been good if that could have sprayed. And it also strikes me, ironically, that it was the subjectivity, I think this didn't come out in the time you had, of these Neo-Vedanta influenced Western mystics, whether it was Huxley, Stace, Pankey, etc., that they had an idiographic approach as well, right? It wasn't just the Shulgins with the shack. These guys didn't look like the Shulgins, right? But they were just as much creatures of their theological presuppositions and their particular, and yet I don't know, I could make a larger point about colonialism, but then they exported that to some universal that clearly does not apply to the overwhelming majority of people who have consumed psychoactive plants in the history of humanity, right? Which are from indigenous communities. And yet this very idiosyncratic, weird formula is the one that still is predominant in a lot of the literature and the scientific literature.
And thank you, Jeff and Paul, for the psychometric Brahmin article. And how bizarre it is to have used mushrooms to try to occasion a visionless experience. And something else we didn't say is that it was after Pankey's first psychedelic experience that he was like, oh, I got to change this thing.
Interesting.
But I guess I would read Pankey as closer to a form of perennialism, which assumes that there is such a thing as the mystical experience and there is different ways of getting there. I do think so. Pankey got involved with the clinical work with the end of life anxiety, and the clinical work, I guess, is idiographic just by its very nature. I mean, you're working with a particular patient, and I think it's actually also an interesting case of pharmacosociality. If you think about the lecture that Pankey gave here in the divinity school, part of what he talked about was that it wasn't just about treating the cancer patient with LSD. It was also about treating their relatives, right? Because what he describes very graphically is that they are afraid of talking to the person who got that diagnosis and telling them that they're going to die. I mean, most of these patients did not know that they had a fatal diagnosis because nobody wanted to tell them. And Pankey describes very graphically that after the LSD therapy with the patient who had been suspecting that they had a fatal diagnosis all along, suddenly something started to happen in the communication within these families, right? So I think that is a perfect example of what I would call pharmacosociality. And of course it's idiographic because it's about these very particular people who are relating to each other with their unique histories, right?
In a conversation largely about non-rational consciousness or transcendent way of knowing, just noticing the beauty of hearing Persian poetry in the original and hearing Rebekah's narrative of the experience in the Amazon, there was something really wonderful about changing that discourse. Thanks. We'll see you soon for Benjamin Breen's keynote.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu. Copyright 2026. The President and Fellows of Harvard College.